Hello, everyone. I'm Aroni Phoenix, the founder of AcademicQuran, the source on Reddit for all things pertaining to Islamic studies, the Quran, and early Islam. I'm also the author of the WordPress blog Scriptural Contexts, which is devoted to the study of the Bible and the Quran in light of their historical and cultural contexts. Today, Dr. Me to discuss their upcoming course, The Bible and the Quran, Comparing Their Historical Problems. Doctors, it's an honor to meet you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. I love what you guys are doing on your Reddit page, so it's good to be on with you.
What I wanted to do was to briefly just ask both of you for a brief overview of your upcoming course, to give my viewers an idea of what the course is about and things like that. I will be providing a link to it in the description below.
Well, I can start. The course is going to be kind of a comparison of issues that critical scholars have had with both the New Testament and the Quran. By critical, I don't mean that they're criticizing these books. I mean that they're taking a historical approach as opposed to a traditional religious approach. And we're going to be asking the same questions of the New Testament that we ask of the Quran. Do we know what the authors originally wrote? Are there contradictions in these texts? How do we use them to know what actually happened in the life of Jesus or the life of Muhammad? And so I'll be talking about the New Testament, Javal will be talking about the Quran, and then we'll compare notes to see if we, what's similar, what's different between these two fields of historical inquiry.
My idea with the course was to kind of what I've learned in the last decade, what kind of class I wish that I had. It is, we want to put out something there that you would get taught at like, a prestigious university, Harvard, Yale, that kind of thing. But it really is like kind of my ideal course as I thought of it. And I thought, what better way than to do it in a comparative way? So, and to do it with the great Bart Ehrman. I mean, come on.
So, professors, what I would like to do also during the course of this interview is to ask both of you specifically some issues regarding various things that you may discuss in the course. I've wanted to pose my first question to Dr. Hashmi. How do you approach the issue of the synoptic problem in the Quran? I mean, we all know the story of the synoptic issue of the Gospels, but I've heard that there is also the same issue with Quranic narratives as well. How do you approach this in your study of the Quran?
Yeah, thanks so much. So first, although I appreciate the battlefield promotion, I'm not a professor yet. I'm at the tail end of my PhD, so I do want everyone to know that. I hope I'm not misrepresenting myself. As far as the synoptic issue, I think it's a fascinating issue. And up until very recently, I realized I didn't even quite understand it. And that's why I think this comparative approach is incredibly important. So I used to use the word doublet and triplets in a very different way than I realize I think they use it in biblical studies. And I'd love to ask Bart about this. But I used to think that doublets and triplets are simply where the same story is narrated in two different places. And that's how I was using it. But now I realize that's probably just parallel passages. So the Quran has tons of parallel passages where the same story is retold in a different way. And if you take a purely if you take this as factual history, I think that causes a lot of problems. So Bart in his classes, he'll talk about how if you take the gospel accounts and you read them just kind of in a linear fashion, you might be like, yeah, it's basically saying the same story. Maybe some details here are different. But if you read them in a parallel way, it can be quite fascinating to see what the differences are. And many believers don't do that. So you never realize that there are all these differences. So I just, a few years ago started doing that with the Quran, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, your mind is blown then. Okay, what do you do about this? So that's as far as parallel passages, what to do. And then as far as, again, Bart can correct me if I'm wrong on this, as far as I understand, doublets and triplets are when like the exact same text, say a long verse or something, is repeated in one place and in another place. And then you have to ask, well, why is that? I would say that right now, at this stage in Quranic studies, it's in the explorative phase. Gabriel Reynolds has written an article on this about Quranic doublets. And if we go with his view, I do think it's going to radically change how we approach the Quran. We'd have to kind of shift away from the single authorship view of the Quran. Nikolai Sinai, I believe, is going to be presenting on this and taking a different view, because right now the dominant view in Quranic studies is that the Quran ultimately does go back to the Prophet Muhammad. So overwhelmingly a single authorship of the Quran. So this issue of doublets may shift that, but it's all up in the air right now. And with Quranic studies, and I'm sure it's the same with biblical studies, you have to kind of wait for when something is published, you have to wait a couple years to see what the reaction in the field is going to be. And so I think that's where we are right now when it comes to that.
Thank you. Professor Ehrman, I wanted to ask you, regarding this course, will you also be discussing some of the historical difficulties with the Hebrew Bible, or is this primarily focused on the New Testament?
I'll be talking somewhat about the Hebrew Bible, but my focus will be the New Testament because it's the area that I'm most expert in, and also most people, most Christians who would be watching this would be most interested, I think, probably in things like the Gospels and historical Jesus and such. But the kinds of issues I'm talking about with the New Testament are very much the same issues as you get in the Hebrew Bible. And in many ways, the problems are even worse in the Hebrew Bible when it comes to things like the time between when an individual actually lived and we have our first account of that person. You know, those if you have stories of Abraham, the father of the Jews, he was living in about the 18th century BCE or so, and our first sources from him may not be till the 6th century. So it might be 1,200 years later before we have a source. With the Gospels, the first Gospel is about 40 years after the life of Jesus, and that's a long stretch, and it creates problems for knowing whether the source is accurate or not because it's 40 years later, and this is our first source, and so it's 40 years. But if it's 1,200 years, that's even a bigger issue. And so I will be referring to the Hebrew Bible, but most of my comments will be on the New Testament.
Thank you, Doctor. I wanted to ask both of you a question regarding interpretation of text, because I understand that this is one of the main points in the course, is that discussing how different ways of reading the Bible and the Quran have had a major influence over the course of human history. Specifically, I wanted to ask both of you, how have particular interpretations of the Bible and the Quran had either a positive or negative impact on the role of women and girls in history, society, and religious formation over the centuries?
Oh, well, I'm happy to start with that, and because Christianity has had a kind of a long and troubled history when it comes to women and girls and their place in the Christian community, but also in society as a whole. The Bible was produced in a very patriarchal society. There's no doubt about that historically, and the Bible itself participates in a good deal of that patriarchy. And so in the New Testament, for example, we are told that women should not ever exercise authority over men, and they're not supposed to teach men or instruct men or have authority over men, that they're to be submissive to their husbands and subject to men. So that's not good from a modern kind of feminist perspective, or just from a modern perspective. I mean, it's not good. So there's that, and there are many Christians and Christian groups that emphasize passages like that in order to stress that women are inferior and need to be submissive to men. And that's led to some very bad things, and still does in the modern world. On the other hand, in the New Testament, in my field, it's clear that women played a prominent role in early Christianity. That in the earliest stages of the Christian church, women were leaders of churches. They were missionaries. We know of a woman who's called a deacon. We have another woman who's said to be one of the foremost apostles of Christianity in the New Testament. And so it appears that in early Christianity, there was a kind of a split between those who thought that women should have roles equal and equivalent to those of men, and the others who didn't. And so it's been both. So there are both positive and negative things that one can say about women, and different interpreters then take those different directions depending on what their own proclivities are.
So from my standpoint, I only have a couple of minutes because I think we're running out of time, which probably saves me by the bell. But I think we're not going to deal with this question in the course, but we are going to deal with a very similar question, which is religion and violence, or scripture and violence. And so I think I would put my answer in a very similar way, which is I think with text, it's always a two-way street. There's a text, but there's always a community of interpretation. Many people have this idea of kind of religions have these essences. They're monolithic. They don't change with time, and they are what, everything is just an outgrowth of what the scripture and the founding moment said, or did. I kind of push back on this, and it is a two-way street. And I think people will be surprised to know how historically, actually, at least when it comes to the Quran, Muslims don't really, historically, they didn't really just read the Quran directly. And, most of the theology and the law is derived from the Hadith, not from the Quran, which is kind of the Hadith is the second scripture, actually. But these things are debated, and, there's varying opinions and interpretations. And I'll just close with what Khalid Abu al-Fadl said, which is the text will enrich you as long as you enrich the text.
In our last minutes together, I just wanted to ask you particularly, what would be the value of someone of faith studying this course? Because I know that there's some controversies over like historical critical studies and things like that.
Again, let me start because I've thought about this issue for a very long time, in large part because my own historical understanding of the New Testament and of the Christian scriptures generally emerged while I was still a faithful Christian, a church attending Christian, active in the Christian community. These issues troubled my faith to the extent that I had been raised to think the Bible had no mistakes in it. It was completely inspired by God. But when I started engaging in this kind of historical analysis, I realized that even though that idea was wrong, I didn't agree with that anymore, that the Bible was completely without mistake given by God. I knew that was wrong, but I realized that in fact the Bible was a much richer and deeper text than I had imagined, that this kind of historical study actually opened up the meaning of this text in ways that was just impossible if you simply thought that it's literally what God wrote. But when you actually put it in a historical context and then understand it historically, the meaning of this text emerges in ways that you just can't imagine otherwise. And for me, that was very useful as a believer. My sense is that whether somebody's a believer or not a believer, history is history, and it's useful to know what happened in the past, and it's useful to know about these texts from a historical point of view, because if it's true, it's true. So when I was changing my faith as a Christian, I latched onto what St. Augustine had said, that all truth is God's truth. And so if something's true historically, then God's behind it. He's not against it. And so we should try to seek the historical truth. That was my view then. And I continue to think that history, knowing about history is not going to hurt somebody's faith. It means that instead of being somebody who doesn't know, they'll be somebody who knows, and they can deal with that in terms of their faith. But it's much better to be a knowledgeable believer. I mean, the opposite of being knowledgeable is being ignorant. Who wants to be an ignorant believer? And so I think it's very useful. This kind of course is extremely useful for both Muslims and Christians.
From my perspective, I actually don't think the course is for everyone, and that might be bad for advertising purposes. But like, if you're what I call a simple believer, who these questions have never been an issue, that's a lot of people in my family. Like they don't think about these things, and I don't want to disturb their faith commitments. That's not my purpose. But the course is for people who have already kind of dipped their toe in the water and explored these issues. But the problem is, what's out in the public is either Islamic apologists on the one side or anti-Islam polemicists on the other. So I'm like, for people who want kind of an educated understanding, what you would get taught at a university, I think this course is for you. And my hope is, whether you're a believer or a non-believer, that you come away with a slightly more sophisticated view of the topic, whichever way you fall on this topic.
Thank you so much for your information, doctors. The course again is called The Bible and the Quran, Comparing Their Historical Problems. Drs. Ehrman, Dr. Hashmi, it was an honor meeting you guys. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to say that I'm a big fan of your academic Quran Reddit, and I encourage everyone to read it. I do it as daily reading now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you so much.